Byline Audio.
This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello and welcome to Byline Radio and the Byline Podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg, live from the Capitol Building, Washington, D.C., as the US and the world come to grips with Donald Trump's election to the White House, the only convicted felon to secure election to the Oval Office, only the second president to win non-consecutive terms of office as well. I'm going to be joined by the Byline Times executive editor Peter Jukes and the Byline Times US correspondent Heidi Siegmund Cuda as we try to weigh up what this means for the United States, the UK and the rest of the world, especially the Middle East, where Trump has been an enthusiastic supporter of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Ukraine, which fears that Trump could block military support in favour of his old chum, the Russian President Vladimir Putin. We were told it was an election that was on a knife edge. It wasn't. Trump won decisively, securing victory in 4 of the 7 swing states: North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and he's ahead in the other 3 as we speak as well. The Republicans have also wrestled control of the Senate from the Democrats, which will make it much easier for Trump to enact legislation. He's already threatened to deport millions of people who he says are in the US illegally and to impose import tariffs. So we can expect roles in government for Robert F. Kennedy in healthcare. He's a noted vaccine skeptic. And of course, Elon Musk, the owner of X and a huge Trump backer. It's just gone noon here. And it is unseasonably warm. It's scheduled to get up to 80 degrees Celsius this afternoon. It is a gorgeous autumn afternoon. But there are signs around the Capitol that the police are preparing for, well, perhaps some kind of trouble. I've seen officers gathering riot shields from the back of a large van. This may just be precautionary, but who knows? But Trump's victory are certainly being seen in apocalyptic terms by some. The writer Seth Abramson has described it as the worst day in American history since Pearl Harbor. Gosh, that's a mighty strong takedown, isn't it? If you're listening and you want to join in, there is a little microphone on your app. Tap it and request access. As I say, we've got Peter Jukes with us. Peter is the executive editor of Byline Times, and also Heidi Siegmund Cuda is going to be joining in as well when she taps the microphone in a little while. But first, let's get a comment on Peter Jukes. And Peter, as I mentioned right at the top, it could have gone either way, but very few people were expecting this scale of victory for Trump. What are we to make of that?
Well, one analysis would be, because of these reasons of the economy and the other factors too, that Biden was well behind and that Harris and Walz developed some momentum. And what the analysis I'm seeing is it would have been worse without that momentum, but never caught up. Because the key thing people feel, and I noticed in New York with cab drivers who were immigrants themselves going, economy is wrong, Biden is sleepy. Obviously, he was replaced by somebody not sleepy, but the Trump's the man because he gets things done and things were better under Trump. So I think that is one explanation, is that Trump has accumulated his votes, increased it 3 times. Biden managed to exceed it in 2020. He's increased it by 2 to 3% across those key swing states. Actually, slightly larger in surprising places like Virginia, New Jersey, and New York. But there was a headwind. I mean, we've seen it across the world. You've seen it in Japan, you've seen it in France, you've seen it here. The governments that went through the cost of living crisis, partly from COVID, the consequence of COVID, and obviously the war in Ukraine, and energy prices going up, have been punished. So I would say that's one key factor, kind of inertia, kind of was already on Trump's favor. The other thing to look at is the surprise, I think, is that people thought women would turn up, and particularly senior women who remembered Roe versus Wade, the importance of that, the overturning of that, the Dobbs Act. And that doesn't seem to have happened so much as Latino and black men switching to Trump. So you have to ask a question. Now, I think it's very, very dangerous territory if we start going down the route some people went after Brexit, or Brexiteers are racist and that thing. That we can't say that those Latino and black men who switched, quite a large percentage Latino. I think Trump won Latino men by 10%, whereas Biden had won them by 30%. They're not a huge section of American, but they're quite a significant one. Black men went up from 10%, 25% supporting him. That might have been from 2016, though. So what you've got is men supporting Trump. Now, is that they don't like women? That's a very difficult thing. What you can say, and I think it's interesting because they're from unionized areas, they're from manual working class areas, that masculinity, manual labor declining as blue collar jobs going, though actually there's more jobs in automobiles now than ever. But the perception that men are under threat may have been a factor which crosses the ethnic divide. And actually, you had this sense, again, a female presidential nominee gets beaten by Trump. Is that a factor? Heidi might be able to illuminate that a bit more. But you may have a bit of economic factors and, importantly, some social, if you like, culture war factors.
In terms of not so much Latin American men, but sort of the Latin American vote in general, Peter, quite a lot of the discussion here has been about how people who are established people from Latin America, people who've made their way under previous waves of immigration, have felt alienated from the more recent wave. Trump was very tough on immigration when he was last in power. Joe Biden, although he did attempt in his later presidency to come to a deal with the Republicans, and arguably that deal was torpedoed because the Republicans could use immigration as a stick with which to beat the Democrats. Nevertheless, in the early years of his presidency, Biden, and obviously Harris as his vice president is implicated in this, Biden was seen as being a soft touch on migration. Something like 7 million undocumented migrants came into the United States. And there was a feeling, I think, certainly from the conversations I've had and the conversations I've listened to, that this new generation of arrivals from Latin America were in some ways advantaged over those who had worked hard to be here through a previous legal route. So that may have been an issue. And I saw you commented this morning, Peter, you mentioned how, let's not discount the huge influence operation that has been perpetrated here, whether through Musk on X, who has been an overt backer and an overt promoter and a financial backer as well of Donald Trump, Jeff Bezos of Amazon choosing not to endorse Harris at the Washington Post. No question that media influence is a big issue here. But I think, as with Brexit, I think it's very easy for progressive people to ignore the fear factor of immigration. And I certainly, when I've been travelling around, I've not just been in DC, I've been out in the suburbs, a lovely place called McLean, but this question of migration, not per se, not anti-migration, but the sense that it's not being controlled has been a point of vulnerability for the Democrats.
Both can be true, Adrian, right? So 2016, as we were leading to the Brexit vote, David Cameron, our then Prime Minister, accused Vladimir Putin of weaponizing migration because his military activities in Syria, he'd intervened in Syria the previous winter, had caused a huge influx or outflight of boat crossings and refugees from Syria. I think if you look at the way the Republicans weaponized the Mexican border and refused to do anything. There's a parallel there too with Netanyahu scuppering any ceasefire. The reports is called him all the time and stopped him. Biden kept on pushing for a ceasefire. That also affected the Muslim vote in places like Michigan, places like Dearborn. A domestic Democratic stronghold went to the Republicans probably on that issue. So what I'd say is yes, immigration, and maybe in a changing world with climate change, migration is a huge issue. It has to be dealt with and dealt with properly. But populists, as we've seen right from the Nigel Farage, his breaking point poster, weaponize it without solving it. And often, as happened after Brexit, the boat started, and then were weaponized by the government. They use it as a weapon rather than actually stopping it. So this is what Donald Trump's going to be faced with, is he's used these issues very, very powerfully, but can he, as weapons, as attack surface against the Democrats? Twitter has, we've seen Elon Musk saying that Britain's going to descend into civil war because of our multi-ethnicity. This has clearly been a line, exploits fear. And Kamala Harris's message of hope or joy didn't read. People are fearful. They felt some empathy or they felt some channeling of their anger. And we now are in this world, we've got to remember, just as we had two Home Secretaries, people of color, Priti Patel, Swela Braverman, enacting this incredibly harsh performative cruelty would never work of the Rwanda plan, for our American listeners, flying incoming would-be asylum seekers to the center of Africa with a country with a terrible human rights record. People are people. And I've always noticed this. I remember a Russian immigrant in the 90s used to help look after our kids, say, but all these Ethiopians coming. There's nothing to stop a demagogue, for people to feel like my status is threatened by the new arrivals. They've got it easy and I've got it hard. And they played on that fear. Trump's solution to immigration is highly illegal, deporting children and families, and actually saying, we'll enjoy putting the kids in cages, one of his advisors, I think Stephen Miller said that. It is a cruel, performative policy. Will it work? Will it be legal? What does it do to the reputation of America? It's very easy to play on fair, very difficult to rein it in.
Absolutely. And Heidi joins us as well. And Heidi said, these are the people who look after your children. These are the people who swirl your coffees, the baristas. And if there is a deportation on the scale that Trump envisages, I don't know how he's going to achieve that. He's talked about bringing in the National Guard. That will actually have a devastating effect on the economy of parts of the United States itself, where lots of poorly paid workers will disappear, but also on Mexico, the next place across the border to where they will presumably be deported. This is not a risk-free or a consequence-free policy, quite apart from the fact of the cruelty that it enacts. Heidi, welcome along. Having read so much of your work in Byline Times and the Byline supplements, I can only imagine you're absolutely devastated today.
Hi, yes, thank you. I've been really enjoying listening to you too. It's actually been calming because all I've been getting is a million panicked calls and text messages from around the world. And, I've been reporting on the Trumpocene, Russian information warfare, how these things play out in history for many years now, but I did allow myself a glimmer of hope. I did allow myself in just really the last 3 days to believe that Americans would ultimately vote for the prosecutor over the felon. And I think what we've learned and what you guys are talking about is that the patriarchy dies hard, and that the people that we thought would care more about the fact that women are actually bleeding out in parking lots because our health care rights have been taken away, that they would actually show up and right this wrong. And that's not what happened. And one thing that we know happened is that we watched a foreign government interfere with our country in multiple ways. We've had a decade of information warfare. We have leaders at the top of the Republican Party in direct communication with Vladimir Putin. That would be Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And we watched terrorist attacks on American soil yesterday disrupt our elections in the form of dozens of bomb threats, which the FBI said originated in Russia. And I have been writing for years, as has Peter and the Byline team, that we are under attack. We need leadership. There's only one more move that I can see that we can make, and I don't see the defenders of democracy anywhere. We haven't dealt with Russian information warfare on any meaningful level, and it struck our polling places in the very heart of democracy yesterday.
Heidi, on that, you, I know, have been to the same place as I have, which is DC jail in Washington. Not inside, I hasten to add, but outside, where there's a nightly vigil by a group of people who are supporting prisoners who were sent to jail after January the 6th, hoping, by the way, now that Trump is back in office, that those people will get a pardon. And I spoke to Brandon Fellows, who was convicted and sent to jail for 3 years for his role in the Capitol riots. And he was adamant that the Mueller report and all that we've read about Russian interference was just conspiracy theory. I heard a radio program that I'm sure you'll be aware of that's syndicated across the United States, that is a late night, early morning radio show called Red Eye Radio, again talking about the idea of Russian involvement all being a conspiracy theory. And it is, for me, terrifying to see that you can have Special Counsel Robert Mueller laying out in great forensic detail the extent of attempts by Russia to interfere with US elections, the level of collusion with officials in Trump's presidential guard, and yet these can be just dismissed as conspiracy theory, as fake news, when you've got some of the finest minds in the country working on identifying this problem.
Yes, we lost the war to this point because we really refuse to acknowledge it exists. And in a very last minute Hail Mary in America in September, as Peter knows, we had multiple things occur where we finally had evidence and words to show the depth of the influence. We found out that popular influencers were actually receiving significant amounts of money from Russia through RT. There were indictments, there were affidavits, there was the US State Department giving us the 6 perfect words that covert influence activities are not journalism. And from there, we were able to piece together that the person who owns this platform has been boosting accounts paid by Russia and continues to prop those accounts up. And we've learned that that is not the information that is being boosted is not journalism. This is not about censorship or free speech. It's literally facilitating attacks on our country. And I think we saw the culmination of that. And from where I am right now in California, I wrote an elegy for my country yesterday. America, I do not believe exists in the way that we knew it. And this morning I woke up a woman without a country.
That's very, very sad to hear, Heidi. What you're referring to there is something I think known as Operation Tenet. And you made the point, I think, in one of your posts recently, that, of course, much of what these influencers pump out will look like journalism. Much of it will be. It's not all propaganda. It's more intelligent than that. Only maybe 20% of it will be propaganda, so that it's disguised, it's hidden in with the good stuff.
Yeah. That's actually part of how this warfare works. It's written in the translated dossier in the 277-page Doppelganger affidavit, as it's known. It repeatedly points out that how it works is 80% of the information on any of these sites that we're referring to should look legitimate. 20% is the amount that is pure pro-Kremlin, anti-Western, anti-Ukraine propaganda. And just the night before the election at 3 a.m., I was up threading about how Elon Musk was promoting an account that, according to many reports and according to an admission from the account itself, was being paid $100 from a Russian operative to post things that were fake videos about Haitian immigrants that were not true. And again, It almost even doesn't matter when we find out it's not true, because by then, this cruel and effective playbook that they're using of othering, of instigating fear and all of that has already entered the conversation. By the time we find out the video is not real, AI driven, it doesn't matter. It's poisoned our narrative. And we've been dealing with this for so many years. And I have begged and written multiple letters to leaders, Democratic leaders in America, to address information warfare in a meaningful way like they do in other countries. And instead, we've had no inoculation, and we saw the really increased digital poison, as we call it, at the beginning of the pandemic, where people were locked home in front of their computers. And that's where so many of us saw so many friends of ours being influenced by people who we now know were actually part of the tenant operation being paid by the Russians. And I don't know what else to say when you wake up and you learn that there were 50 bomb threats, according to the FBI, instigated by Russia. And we still are here showing images of Trump on stage with his family. And personally, I can't endure that again. This is worse than 2016, because in 2016, there was a lot of things we didn't know. We know so much more now. And yet, as Peter knows, as we've been reporting for years, it's continually treated as politics is normal, when in fact our country has been under attack in ways that we have seen in other countries, in Ukraine, in Estonia, in Georgia, in Moldova, everywhere. And here we are again. I wake up and we just basically turned over 250 years of democratic rule and said, here you go, new axis of evil. Here's your prop, Donald Trump and JD Vance. Good luck.
Heidi, I'll come back to you before too long. Peter, we'll take a call in a moment from River Song, but I just want to talk to you about the international dimension of this. I mentioned in our conversation the other day, I was astonished at how many Brexiteers, that wing of the Conservative Party, was so keen to embrace Donald Trump, because America First was always part of Trump's political message. So these people who expected a great deal from the United States as a result of Brexit, where did they think that was going to come from? To be fair, by the time Brexit had been done, in Boris Johnson's phrase, Joe Biden was president, and clearly he was no particular friend of giving Britain a particularly easy time of it in economic terms. But Britain's not going to get any special favours. I heard the UK described as America's closest ally on public radio in the United States today, but we're not getting any special favours. And this is a country which is promising to invoke tariffs of between 10 and 20%. Trump has suggested privately that tariffs on Chinese goods may be as much as 60%. I mean, the potential impact of this on world trade is dire, and the impact on the UK as an exporting nation is potentially dire.
Just quickly on this, just going very briefly back what Heidi said, because she mentioned something like $100 to post. We know there's 10 million of Russian money went to this one, these four tenant media. And talking to Bill Browder, he reckons Putin would spent billions on a Russian influence operation, because that's the cost of like 3 or 4 jets, and it's probably more effective. Following that money theme, why Kemi Badenoch stood up at her first PMQ's parliamentary questions and to criticize Keir Starmer about his attitude to Trump and pick him up on something he said before. So we can see already the Conservative Party engineering itself around a pro-Trump position. Boris Johnson has already endorsed him, was on TV last night praising him. Liz Truss, another former MP, has praised him. And of course, the would-be alternative to the Conservatives, even more right-wing, Nigel Farage, flew to Mar-a-Lago. I mean, I don't know if these sort of constituents in Clacton these days got much of a look at. So we have this issue of the funnel of money, oligarch money. It could be a Russian, it could be a hedge fund, American hedge funds, and it's this crypto guy and a hedge fund guy, and now in the Senate. It could be Russian oligarch money. It doesn't really matter. The flow of dark money in politics unleashed in America, particularly after the Citizens United ruling, which said corporations had rights to free speech, has flown across the Atlantic and landed up in what we call Tufton Street, these opaquely funded organizations that call themselves think tanks are basically lobbying outfits, and you don't know who they're lobbying for. So this will have a big effect on British politics. And the idea of a trade war, Keir Starmer's proposition for the budget he enacted or announced last week was growth, right? Growth will get us out of poor finances and lack of public services, which they've inherited from 14 years of Conservative government. But these trade wars, I mean, this is 1930s style. That's why we had, the Wall Street crash ended in the massive depression, which ended in World War II and fascism, was because of trade wars. And it's economics 101 that Britain would be, as a trading nation, having already cut itself off from the European Union, not having the same sort of access to the single market we used to have, would be really caught in the middle. As we are caught in the middle, I must say, I'll just make one final point before handing over to a question for somebody else, that we've got banged on for the last, God knows, 10 years since Brexit about foreigners coming to these shores, stop the boats. Well, what we've got to stop is foreign money and oligarchs undermining, influencing our elections, be able to spend money on parties. Elon Musk be able to post whatever he likes, saying civil war is inevitable here. So we've got to look after our borders. And it's not the problem with a few people on small boats, asylum seekers. It's this dark money from overseas.
Well, Peter, before we go to that, Cora, I do just want to make this point as well, because I think these two things are intertwined, whether we're talking about the UK's position vis-a-vis trade with the United States, whether we're talking about militarily, because, of course, Trump is, to say the least, a great skeptic about the role of NATO, certainly in its traditional form. If we've got these authoritarian power blocks forming in the world, China, North Korea, Russia, potentially the United States turning its back on Europe, notwithstanding the attack on Ukraine right now by Russia, then where does that leave the UK? We're thousands of miles from the United States, the natural block for us to be part of, both in terms of trade and militarily, is the very block that we turned our back on in 2016, and we said, we can live without you. Thanks, bye.
Yes, I mean, even before, this brief surge of hope, especially after that Iowa poll showed Kamala Harris potentially winning a state which was a sort of traditional red state, people have said, the fact it's this close, the fact we could be facing Trump, who's openly said, well, he'll, remove help from Ukraine and did so through the Republican Party in Congress most of this year. The fact that we are worrying about America means we've got to grow up. The 1945 security umbrella of the US over Europe is over, as in a way, in the same way that in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell. Now we're having the D-Day retreat, and if it wasn't Trump now, it would have been somebody else later. And where is Britain? Where is the new power bloc? And actually, as you say, not just for trade and the gravity of trade and all that, our values, if you look at religion, death penalty, abortion, gun control, we're much closer to any European, despite the lovely language that Heidi speaks, than America. So culturally and trade-wise, we should be close to Europe. But obviously, America's a superpower. It controls our nukes, technically. So we're in a huge dilemma.
Let's welcome to the conversation River Song. Hello, River Song. Just tap on your microphone and welcome to Byline Radio and the Byline Podcast. How are you doing?
Good. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, yeah. Where are you, River Song?
I'm from Iowa.
We thought Iowa was going to spring a surprise a few days ago, didn't we?
And Iowa went for Obama twice, and so it didn't seem that crazy to think that Harris had a chance of doing it again. But since Iowa went blue, I tuned in and watched some videos of Senator Grassley's town hall meetings where he would go to rural Iowan towns and have these town hall meetings. And luckily, somebody recorded some of them and published them online. But I watched as rural residents asked Grassley crazy questions that they had heard online. Like, is it true the Ukrainians are Nazis? And Grassley almost seemed somewhat startled by the batshit crazy stuff his constituents were asking him. And in one of them, he actually asked, "Where are you getting your news?" And, an older woman said, "TikTok." And so we have seen this rapid acceleration of technology where Americans are behaving in ways that in the past that are quite frankly not normal. A rural elderly resident of Iowa is on Facebook rage posting conspiracy theories, and that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. He would have been in a coffee shop drinking coffee with his neighbor. So this poison has been accelerated, and the rapid advancement in technology, and I believe the failure of democracies to regulate them, to get on top of that and regulate the billionaires who have gotten rich from their platforms scamming their users.
It's really interesting listening to you speaking from a US perspective. Peter and I obviously based in the UK, and we have a more regulated media landscape than is the case in the United States.
Right.
For example, when Brexit came around, and I'm sure Peter can speak to this, there was a phenomenon that we've seen in relation to Trump as well, which is both sidesism, the idea of treating both sides of an argument as if they have equal weight, the fear of calling out one side rather than another as being dishonest, as being a liar. And of course, that itself can inflame tensions, that can then create the kind of furore, the confusion that some of these demagogues enjoy. But I think there's a responsibility on mainstream media and indeed on the owners of these platforms that you're talking about to challenge robustly and vigorously hate speech and fake speech.
Correct. And not even just speech, but a lot of these platforms in the US, people are victimized by cyber fraud and cybercrime on these platforms, and the billionaires who are profiting from it could take actions to prevent it, but they won't unless they're regulated. So they're profiting off of crimes.
So you make such a brilliant point, and I think this is where it's different from just the both sidesism, isn't it? Is that Facebook, Meta, Twitter, X, they are a kind of fraud on us because what they do is a fraud because we think we're getting it free, but we're not. We're the product. They sell our data. And Carol Cadwell a great friend of mine working with a podcast series about Russian spies in Westminster coming soon. Watch this space. But she was the first in the Observer to really expose this with Cambridge Analytica, micro targeting. So you would see during, obviously Mueller exposed all the Black Lives Matter, Sharia groups, gun control groups, that they play different messages to different audiences. You saw it very, very clearly recently, didn't you? You had Kamala's to the Muslim community in places like Dearborn. Kamala is a friend of Zionism. She's going to make sure people die in Gaza. The reverse message, the more religious Jews like in Brooklyn or whatever, Kamala hates Jews, she's siding with Hamas. And you have this micro-targeting of who are all now living in a different reality. And they make millions out of this. Musk is so transparent about it. And I just think, if we think back to Cambridge Analytica, it was messaging, it was analyzing your data, it was micro-targeting you on your characters and where you lived and all that. And Musk has just taken that to scale.
Yes, he's taken it to scale, but also Facebook did too. And I think Peter Thiel was on the board of directors of Facebook. I might be wrong, but I think he was.
He was the original investor. Yeah.
I think there's just been this rapid acceleration of technology and the weaponization of it, and democratic countries have been slow to work together to stop it.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes.
Because you're right. For years, I have been saying, along with members of my podcast team, that we need an international tech treaty. We need to deal with this with our international allies. And for me, the borders that I've been concerned about are internet borders. We've given hostile foreign powers direct access to the minds of our citizens without any filter, any inoculation, anything to actually help defend people. And so that's, I believe, a big part of the reason why we are here in this very
Right.
grave and tragic day in American history.
River, stay there. And I just want to ask this of Heidi and Peter, because I think it's a really important point that is made by Jane Gilbert. Jane says, can we regulate what they call free speech when it's not directly violating laws of discrimination or hate speech? In those cases, it's quite easy, isn't it, to say that is hate speech. It often isn't regulated and it often isn't acted upon, but I think most people would recognise it when they see it. But one man's fake news is another woman's hard truth, isn't it? And it's the practicality of regulating that without having some kind of really strict kind of Soviet-style enforcement and censorship of your media.
Right.
We're talking about something on a scale I don't think has ever been done in a free country before.
From my perspective, what I'm seeing is that in America, we do have regulations that require, for example, disclosure on political ads. But billionaires and probably even foreign governments can circumvent that by hiring keyboard armies offshore to just pump out fake accounts and basically marketing disguised as authentic humans. And so it seems to me like that's something that could be regulated because we regulate political ads and essentially they're using these platforms to circumvent these laws. They have found a way around the regulations that apply to political ads.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I don't know whether you, Peter, or Heidi want to talk to that. I just think at a practical level, enforcing regulation, even if you might want it, it comes with a significant amount of risk.
Adrian, I don't understand this quite. I mean, there are things called terms and conditions. You're on a site, you know, if you go to Butlins and you start weeing in the swimming pool, right? You'll probably be thrown out, right?
It wasn't me, Peter.
You know what I mean? Obviously, that's restricting your freedom. But if you are on a site, you are threatening other people, you're bringing it into disrepute. Also, let alone, it's actually a very good point. I guess from iOS says you're breaching laws of undeclared spending, you're indulging in fraud, conspiracy, incitement to violence, defamation. Of course, the law, even in America, applies to free speech. The problem is, and why Facebook and Twitter, they say we're not a publisher, we're just a platform. But they are a publisher. I mean, they're obviously a publisher. That's the only good thing about Musk take over X, Twitter, and turn it into X. You can see him gaming the playing field. You can see him promoting these Russians. He's a publisher. He's not a neutral platform. And Silicon Valley managed to get this exemption. Oh, we're not like the New York Times, who you can sue, and you know where their address is. Or a newspaper in the UK, which is badly regulated under IPSO. We're just this transparent platform. We let them get away with this lie. They become billionaires, but now we know they're not transparent. They have their own vested interests. They sell our data. If I'm in the lounge, and look, they ask me in Starbucks now, so I'll let you on this slightly tired peroration. They warn you on the cup, don't they? The coffee might be hot, right?
Right.
Because of their legal liabilities or somebody must have burned them. In every restaurant in the UK now, even every little cafe, they ask you, do you have any allergies? Because somebody sued them because they didn't tell them. Why the tech giants get beyond the standard regulations, even of a commercial company, just beggars belief.
I do have one question that I want to ask everybody. My question is, I think the U.S. government and some of our Democratic allies might have information that, if it were declassified and released, could potentially help us in our battle going forward.
Absolutely. We know this, yeah.
So should we be asking Biden and our Democratic allies to release that information. Is that wise? I mean,
Well,
I know.
they were going to, but when they released the doppelganger affidavit and the tenant, they said the Russians had released this of 2,000 influencers they had approached, right? And they said they would release more in a week. I don't know why Biden or the DOJ stopped that, because maybe they thought they'd follow the patterns of these people like Tenet Media and catch them out, which is a good sort of surveillance technique if you're a spook. Or maybe they just didn't want to be James Comey, and tip an election. Because a lot of people, like we know that Tucker Carlson went to Russia. He's probably one of the influencers. So I don't know. If they released it now, what good is it?
Okay, Peter, let's bring in another Peter who wants to join in the conversation as well with you, me and Heidi. Go on, Peter.
Hi. Yeah, my big concern is obviously Ukraine. I kind of supported Ukraine. I visited there as a pilot since 2014 and then obviously stopped. But I really just do not know what Trump will do with Ukraine. And I could actually see this leading to the breakup of NATO. I'm just not convinced that the biggest problem with Ukraine is they've used escalation all the way through, and escalation is also to do with gas in certain quarters, but it's also to do with making the people frightened of what's going to happen in Ukraine. But I cannot see a solution. Either you fully equip Ukraine, which they haven't been up until now. They're the only modern army who have fought without air cover, and that costs lives. They pleaded for tanks, and we drip-fed them. They pleaded for aircraft. We drip-fed them. And oh no, you can't use that because it's got a chip of ours in there and we don't give permission. And what do you guys feel will come from Trump? Because he seems to think he's going to fix this really quickly.
One way to fix it, because he is such a key power broker here, for him to say that he's going to remove all military support for Ukraine and effectively force Zelensky to accept a compromise which would end the war, which would see vast tracts of Ukraine handed over to Putin, give Putin essentially what it was. But I think you were right there, Peter, when you talked about the potential impact on NATO, because those who are most directly affected by Putin, to be fair to the United States, are not the citizens of the United States, are they? They're the citizens of Europe, the citizens of Eastern Europe. Poland has been building up its military. Germany, for very good reasons that we all know from history, has been reluctant to build its army, reluctant to commit huge amounts of spending towards its military. But it may find that it has to do so. And it goes back to the point I was making a little bit earlier about a European bloc maybe emerging de facto in the world, if only for the purposes of self-defense, because Europe individually cannot compete with these giant superpowers, whether it is the United States, whether it is China, whether it is Russia. Europe's only hope really is to hold together and form some kind of power bloc, not just a political bloc, but maybe a military bloc. My blood runs cold as I say that, because who wants to be sitting here in the sunshine talking about forming military blocs? But to protect countries like Ukraine from Russian aggression, that may be the only answer. Go on, Peter.
Yeah. You have to be a little bit careful here. Ukraine stopped Russia basically on its own. It had a few anti-tank missiles in February 2022, but it was already, Russia was only the second best army in Ukraine. Now, in the last 2.5, 3 years, Putin has created a war economy. He's lost 500,000 men. He is so embedded in this special military operation they thought would be over in 3 days. They had their uniforms for their parade. So Ukraine itself, I think, is very, very difficult to defeat. And then, let alone the biggest donors to Ukraine, per capita of their income is not America. It's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. I think the Polish army could quite easily defeat the Russian army. It is an attenuated army. The one thing they have is nukes and some residual air force. So I don't really think we need America to defeat Russia in Ukraine. Russia has the GDP of Spain. It's a big country, it has 140,000 people, a lot of poverty, and now it's taking out tanks from the 1960s. So there is a scenario, and I think Oz Katsu says this, whereby freed from the restraint of Biden and his security advisors, Zelensky could actually be a bit more gung-ho. But the reality is, it's unlikely with a Trump presidency that he could have enough firepower to push back through the Donbass and get Zaporizhia, bits of Zaporizhia back. So what we'd get is cementing, like we did in 2014, the front lines as that happened in, the invasion and they were cemented in the Donbass, further west for Russia as it rebuilds its strength, which is always the fear to invade again. So that's when we have a window to come together as Europe, because most of the Ukrainians have left the East. The East will take years to rebuild. The reality is, what's the precedent? How do we stop Russia? And now, how do we stop Russia without America?
Well, but Peter, let me put this question as well to Heidi, because I think a lot of the support for Trump comes from this notion. I mean, America's an empire that does not speak its name, really, but it's had immense power throughout the world for generations now. But the idea of losing troops in Iraq, the idea of losing troops in Afghanistan and being forced to retreat with your tail between your legs, that's not something that any US president wants to countenance. And I think Trump has played into that. And if you ask the bigger question, why should the United States, why should the taxpayers of the United States, why should the troops of the United States put themselves on the line to protect Europe when Europe itself won't do that? I think that's a reasonable question, isn't it, for the people of America to ask themselves.
All I know is for a year I've been saying Trump must lose and Ukraine must win. What happens in Ukraine matters for the entire Western world. And as I'm listening to this conversation, I just keep thinking that until we have a shared narrative of truth again in America, and I dare say the West, we're not going to be able to move forward and make decisions in a cohesive way. And again, listening to everyone's comments, I keep thinking, if it was Agent Orange that was blanketing my country, we would do something about it. But because it's this thing that we can't see and we're losing minds at scale, and depending on what you're reading, you might think that Ukraine is filled with Nazis, or you might not know that Putin has been prosecuted for trafficking children out of Ukraine. There are so many human rights reasons why we need to support Ukraine. And I think that with our collective amnesia, we've already forgotten that Trump was essentially ticking everything off of Putin's wish list in his first 4 years. And also, we go back to the 80s when Trump was going back and forth to Russia, coming back and taking out anti-NATO ads. I just think all we have to do is look at Ukraine and look at what Paul Manafort did there, and then look at what Paul Manafort did when he propped up Trump in America. It's all part of the same war. And I just don't think that we can have this conversation without looking at the bigger picture, bigger players, and realizing that, again, it's all part of the same war. And I feel like we know that here because of the work that you guys have done around Brexit and all these same players continually propping up essentially pro-Kremlin desires.
We will carry on for about another 10 minutes or so, by the way. And I'll come back to you, Peter. We'll also take a call from Civic Crisis, but we'll probably call time on it in 10 or 15 minutes because, fascinating though it is, people have got lives to get on with and things to do. But go on, Peter S., who was our caller. Did you want to make a concluding point?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that we do have to remember that Russia are incapable of keeping an agreement. But they hold 4 annexed territories. The most important to them is the piece which actually runs from Mariupol down to Crimea. And Putin would never give that up. And it actually covers about 90% of the Ukrainian coast. You have Odessa, which is the last really viable city which Putin is desperate to have, because his plan was always to go on round and encircle Ukraine with like a castle. And his intention was to go down and take over Moldova and then literally take what he wants out of Ukraine while keeping it firmly under his foot. Any agreement he made, in 2 years' time, when he's reinforced those areas he's held, he'll make a false flag attack on Crimea and say, you Ukrainians have done this and now the agreement's off, we're attacking Odessa. And then he'll carry on into the Balkans. Anyway, that's just a point I wanted to make.
I don't think you'll get a lot of disagreement from our panel on that, Peter. Thank you so much for joining in. Somebody called Civic Crisis, which is a US strategy group, are joining in. Have we got a name, Civic Crisis?
Yeah, thanks. This is James with Civic Crisis.
Hi, James. Welcome.
Appreciate having me and enjoy listening to your guys' takes, share your concerns. But I think it would be hasty to jump to conclusions about the American support for Ukraine being cut off. I don't think that's the case here. And we'll hope for the best. I think even with the Trump administration coming into office in January, I think he's aware that Ukraine will still need the support of the United States.
And James, tell me, you are what, a consultancy group, a political strategy group?
Yes.
And would you expect or hope to be part of the Trump administration?
I think no. But
Is that for political reasons or just because that's not where your work takes you?
no, it's just not where my work takes me for the time being.
Yeah.
But some of my friends will be. I do
Yeah.
know some people who will be, and they do join me sometimes with what we're doing here. But yes, I think it's going to be really crucial to see a lot of who Trump brings in to his cabinet and what he does with the military. We'll see, because like I was saying, I'll reiterate, I think Trump will support Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued why you think that, though, because, he's talked about getting the conflict sorted in a matter of weeks. He suggested that the war in Ukraine would not have happened if he had stayed in the White House. I mean, of course, there had already been incursions and land grabs into Ukraine while he was president, but the full-scale invasion occurred after he was president, and he argued that was evidence of Biden's weakness. So, I mean, he's not a fan, is he, of US involvement? The Republicans held up significant aid to Ukraine, which made life much more difficult for them on the battleground.
Yes, all that is true. But I think with the situation as it is now, I think the last thing that this man's going to want to do is to appear weak. So I think he will support Ukraine with the maximum strength of the U.S. military and support, just to appear strong, if nothing else. But I think he also cares about the Ukrainians too.
But this is the one ray of hope I give to my benighted friends across the Atlantic. You're our brothers, you're our sisters. What hurts you hurts us. And we're in mourning for you too, and for democracy as a whole. But Trump, like Boris Johnson, is completely venal. What Trump cares about, he doesn't care about Russia or ideology he cares about himself. And if he can utilize Putin's support, he always looks up to Putin because he wants to be somebody like Putin, really scary. But if he can get away with it, we've seen a lot of his policies. He would shift and shape. There's no anything beyond his own ego really going on there. That's why the advisors matter, and why he will, as our guest says, for the sake of perception, do something really weird just to look strong. So in his age, his randomness, his maybe cognitive problems, and his huge self-serving ego, there may be some hope he's too chaotic or too he won't do somebody else's bidding.
Anybody who's read Mary J. Trump's book about her brother will recognise the kind of the man baby that you've described there, Peter. I want to give the final word to Heidi. It's a tough day, Heidi, I think, for anybody of a progressive nature who cares about this fantastic country, this great country of the United States. I mentioned in our conversation with Peter the other day, for all its flaws, and every country, of course, has its flaws, the idea of the United States stands as a beacon for the world. It truly does, a place of democracy, of freedom, of liberty. Can you give us a little shard of hope, Heidi, to end with?
Unless we see some big moves between now and January 6th, I'm pretty much out of hopium. My hopium tank is low. I think what we've learned more than anything is that it can happen here. And as I told you last week, Adrian, I've turned to history to guide me in this moment. And a reporter in Berlin in the 30s, Bella Fromm, wrote, "There are men everywhere who would sell out humanity for their own personal profit. There are stupid and emotional masses everywhere who can be found to follow them, given a few slogans and some nice uniforms." And I think that we have just seen that reality in America. And I started by saying that I believe that our American dream, if it's not dead, it certainly took a huge hit. And I would like to be wrong. I would love James to be right. And I thank everybody for this conversation.
Heidi, great to speak to you, as well as Heidi's fantastic work here at Byline Times. You can listen to her as well on the Radicalised pod, which is a must listen. Peter, anything you want to draw our attention to? You've been active as well as the Byline Times, putting out some Byline TV, I think, of recent days.
Yes, they interviewed Bill Browder Castile, who else, and Charles Bretton Gordon about Ukraine. And then today, coming out later, maybe out by now, we've been interviewing people on the streets of Ukraine and talking to experts there, journalists there, about the impact on Ukraine of this result. So yes, if you want to know more about Ukraine, go over to Byline TV and find us on YouTube.
If you're listening live, you're listening to Byline Radio, but when it becomes a podcast, it'll be on the Byline podcast stream. We've, I like to think, done some pretty good work here in the US, in Washington. I'm fascinated to speak to the Jan 6th, who, this was obviously on the eve of the election, and he was saying that even if Trump had lost legitimately, he wanted to see an overthrow of democratic government in the US. Absolutely mind-boggling and chilling stuff, but I like to think I must listen here on Byline Podcast. And my conversations both with the people on the Women's March in Washington on Saturday, some great, really savvy women on that march. And on that same day, I also went to a polling station in McLean in Virginia, which gave me great insight into both Kamala Harris supporters, but also ordinary Trump supporters as well. And, you know, we have to recognise, I think both of you have said, that Trump supporters are not evil, they're not demons. Many of them are just ordinary people who are scared, frightened by some of the things they see going on in the world around them. So that bears saying. If you're listening to this on the podcast, by the way, I should thank Harvey White, who has helped to produce this episode as well, back in Birmingham. I'll be back again soon with at least one more dispatch from Washington before heading home. But thank you to Heidi Siegmund Cuda. Thank you to Peter Jukes. Thank you to all of you for listening. And don't forget, if you want to support our work, then the best thing you can do is take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our wonderful monthly newspaper or news periodical, edited by Hardeep Matharu. It's got great articles that you cannot read anywhere else, along with the best of our online work. So head over to bylinetimes.com and take out a subscription to the Byline Times if you can. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline